It's initiated by the Arataka Councillor.
Hello and welcome everyone to the user fees and charges review. This is an open workshop and I'll hand over to the team. Christine will start us off.
Okay, so user fees and charges. So this is a result of a decision that you made through the annual plan process where you said you wanted to look at user fees and charges to flow through to the 26-27 annual plan. So the team working on this is a combination of the corporate planning team and the finance team. I think probably don't know Holly, who's recently joined the corporate planning team, so she'll be leading it from in terms of the corporate planning on Jeremy's side, and then Tracy from the financial side. So what we want to cover today, if somebody pushes the forward button on the slide, is it really is just an introduction. So it's not getting into any specifics on any particular user fees themselves. It's really just discussing what is the review, what framework does the review need to work within, what are we proposing in terms of an outline of the process that you would step your way through and the timeline, and just sort of a bit of an overview of financial context of user fees and charges. And we've also given you in the handout pack, we're happy to answer any questions, just user fees and charges conversations that the councils of previous elected groups have had with the community over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, so you can see what topics have been discussed and whether or not they proceeded and what those look like, just to give you a bit of context. So I'll hand over the team just to work their way through the PowerPoint.
Yes, thank you, Christine. The purpose of today, like Christine said, is to initiate the fees and charges review and go through the process and timeline. So the review of fees and charges is being carried out in parallel with the annual plan, with the annual plan process ending in a combined community consultation period from around February to April of next year, with adoption in June. The work that we've done to date is that we've engaged with activity managers throughout the organisation to gather insights into areas where they've identified issues, opportunities, particularly those that have an impact on general rates. In our next workshop, next week on the 21st of August, we'll work through this work that we've done already, which will help define the scope of the review and determine which fee areas you'd like to have a good look at and think of some proposed changes. Oh, sorry. That would help. So what should also be noted is that we will be starting the review of we'll start the process of the long-term plan next year, which also means that we'll be reviewing the revenue and financing policy. The revenue and financing policy is the framework that determines how funding is allocated across council activities, including fees and charges. So some of the proposals from this review may be more appropriately implemented through the LTP process, particularly if they require more time for analysis, development, or pre-consultation with the community. So what are fees and charges? Sorry. Fees and charges are a way of recovering costs for services that benefit particular individuals or groups rather than the wider public. They differ from general rates, which are shared across all ratepayers regardless of use. Charging users helps ensure that costs fall on those who actually use a service, for example, someone applying for a building consent or hiring a council venue. It's more equitable that users contribute rather than all ratepayers subsidising every service that we provide. So each year, councils adopt their fees and charges schedule, which is often part of their annual plan process, with a comprehensive review usually done within a long-term plan. If there's a significant change in how an activity is funded or a new charge proposed, then it's likely that we'll need to consult with the community. So there's key legislation that's guiding our fees and charges. The main one is the Local Government Act. Section 101 requires councils to consider how each activity will be funded. This includes weighing up factors like community benefit and their ability to pay. Section 103 requires councils to adopt a revenue and financing policy, which outlines a mix of funding sources for each activity, including rates, fees, grants, and borrowing. Section 150 allows council to prescribe fees for services provided, and Section 252 permits recovery of reasonable costs where no specific fee is set. Alongside the Local Government Act, there are many other statutes, much like the Building Act, Resource Management Act, and the Dog Control Act. These provide guidance such as cost recovery principles or public notification requirements. So, up on the board, we've got our current revenue and financing policy, which is adopted by the council through the long-term plan process, and is included within the actual long-term plan document. It sets out the funding sources for council's activities over the next 10 years and the rationale for these choices. It provides a list of sources to fund operating costs, which includes user fees, grants, financial contributions, borrowing, and rates, etc. And as mentioned before, the revenue and financing policy will be reviewed next year as part of the long-term plan process. So up on screen also is our current funding needs analysis, or an example of one. This funding needs analysis that sits within the policy provides the background and analysis to explain the funding decisions made by council for each activity, such as animal services, libraries, and transport. It looks at how each activity impacts community outcomes, who benefits from the activity and for what period of time, who creates the need for service, what funding sources will fund the activity, and the rationale behind this. The funding needs analysis is the first step in reviewing the revenue and financing policy and informs the decisions for setting funding bands. So the funding bands are structured guidelines that define the expected proportion of funding for a specific activity from various sources. In Council's revenue and financing policy, these are percentage ranges from 0 to 30%, 30 to 70%, and 70 to 100%. The use of these bands, set out like this, enables us to make variations year on year without deviating from the policy itself. And as shown on the screen, it's a little bit small, but in the first column you'll see user charges. So the tick indicates that this revenue type is being used to fund that activity. And the shading, or the colour block, indicates what percentage. So the darker it is, the higher the percentage. So where an activity provides a broader community outcome, such as community services, library, community development, we rely less on user fees and more on general rates. As we progress throughout this review, it'll be important to consistently reference the revenue and financing policy and the funding bands set within. Any proposed changes throughout this process must remain within these established ranges. If they do fall outside of this, will need to be deferred to the long-term plan when we review this policy. So the revenue and financing policy, also sets key principles for fees and charges. So the current principles we have are that we take a user pays approach. They reflect value of assets and environment. They're fair and equitable. They capture non-ratepayer users of TCC amenities. They enable demand management, reflect capital investment. They're consistent across council, and they're simple to administer and understand. I'll now pass on to Tracy.
Good afternoon. The pie chart that you can see up there is probably fairly familiar to you. It's come out of the 2026 annual plan, looking at sources of operating revenue. Just point out that water by metre is in the nature of a fee, but for financial reporting purposes, it's always included as a rate. So 15% of our total revenue, apart from water by metre, we are collecting through fees and charges in the current financial year. In terms of trends, what you can see there is that rates, which is the dark blue line, has increased and has been budgeted to increase through the LTP, supporting the growth of the capital program, which is the green line. And over that same period of time, user fees, which is the orange line, have been and are projected to be fairly flat. So the 15% proportion that we have now was a much higher proportion back in 2020 in terms of our revenue. 15. Sorry, I don't have that. It looks like it's,
Sorry.
I don't know, 25, 30. This graph, and my apologies, the one you've gotten, Stella, had the wrong key. So that big yellow block in the middle is regulatory, and the big blue block hasn't changed, that's airport. Those are the two areas where we have the highest fees and charges. Yeah, the highest fees and charges in regulatory and the airport. In terms of what activities are included in these areas, transport is largely parking fees, so that's the green colour. Spaces and places is mostly the holiday park and cemeteries, that is the purple colour, and other is mainly commercial rental of our properties, and trade waste, which is wastewater. One thing you may notice is that those are areas which don't tend to be infrastructure heavy. So depreciation and interest costs that come from heavy capital investment are unlikely to fall into these fees and charges conversations. And that's just the context of where we are right now.
So what's next in this review? So we'll be coming back to you next week on the 21st of August. We'll go through some of our initial findings from the discussions that we've had with activity managers to date. And we hope to be able to get an understanding from you where you would like to focus your attention within this review. Given the large number of fees that we do have, we would like to be able to focus our attention on those where there is room for improvement. And the material for that workshop will be provided to you hopefully by the end of the week. Then on the 16th of September, we will be coming to a council meeting where we'll adopt or approve what we decide to progress with. And then we have 3 workshops in September and October where activity managers will join us and we'll be able to go through their areas in detail and talk about some proposed changes. Thank you.
So that's really all we wanted to cover. Said in the back of at the back of that PowerPoint in your Stella is a list of the previous discussions with community about fees and charges that have been held and what some of the key points were, what was proposed and what actually happened, and if you've got any particular areas that you want to indicate now to us that you want to focus on, otherwise we'll have that conversation at the next session. So I just wanted to check in that you're comfortable with this sort of timeline, and what this would get us to by the end of the year is clarity so that it can flow into budgets if you wanted to have increases and into your community consultation.
Not automatic. Just saying, focusing the attention on areas where there's room for improvement. So have you got a sort of a pre-list of terms of what those are? Be good to get those, just as an. Thank you.
So that's effectively what we're going to bring you next week, is a run through of each activity and where we think there's a better than the average chance of having a conversation or a worse than average chance.
Also, discussion around the principles that was set out in one of the earlier slides, I think section 103 or something, how do we start that discussion around establishing the principles? Has a lot of work been done in the past, and if so, well, where is that located around the principles? Because it feeds into later discussions about fairness and equity, and differentials, etc.
So things like the revenue and financing policy have been around for a long time. 2002, when the Act brought these things in. They evolve a bit each 3 years, not a lot. If you look at those 8 principles which Holly put up earlier on, I suspect there are very few single conversations about a particular user fee regime which fits all 8 of those. So the compromises amongst yourselves is where the juice is on this. Because not everything will be able to be both simple and consistent and user pays and enable demand management. It's how you collectively work with those principles. Through this process, we've got the revenue and financing policy, so we don't really want to amend it this year because there's a LTP coming next year. So probably working within those, but the balance is very much your decision. If there's another principle which is completely different to those 8, then let's talk about bringing that one in for the LTP the year after.
Right, and then perhaps that could happen at the commencement of our next session, potentially, if members identified some principles that they'd like to see in there.
If the members have got different principles to those 8,
Yeah.
then yeah, let's talk about it.
Cool.
Happy to talk about it now.
Because the work that we're doing and bringing back has taken into account these principles and the thinking of what we're coming back and saying these ones we think have got more opportunity and align well with the principles, and these ones have got less opportunity and don't align. So if you've got a different view on these principles, or you'd like to see something more emphasised more or less, that will also affect what we bring back to you. So, yep. So we've worked on the basis of this. It'd be good to get that either confirmed or any changes.
I'll go. My question is around on the funding needs analysis, and just looking through all those boxes or ticks and crosses and things. The one that doesn't make sense to me is sort of a controversial one, which is the city centre development, and just thinking of the Papamoa residents and ratepayers discussion out there some months ago, where, as our good councillor from Papamoa has advocated, that there's a user fees, or targeted rate component, which is only one sort of step away from a user fees approach in terms of getting a group of people to pay more for some infrastructure in their part of the city. And so what constantly comes up from some of those communities is, what is the philosophy? Is there a fair and equitable approach? Is it consistent across council? And the view from in the community, rightly or wrongly, is that it isn't in that way. And I guess it's interesting that we have a tick for the grants and subsidies, etc., which may not amount to a huge amount, but there is a user charges component that hasn't been acknowledged, like the parking contribution. I'm just trying to understand, is that a philosophical thing that's not seen as appropriate for city centre development, but it's just a practical diversion of funds, or is it something which was left off and should have been a tick, or it just doesn't kind of stack up to me, because that's going to be a big chunk of that project will be funded, or those projects, I should say, three big projects will be funded by parking fees.
Yes, and I haven't got to grips with all the details here. There's always a difference between the project to develop and then the ongoing activities. So the ongoing activities will have the user fees and charges. I don't know where things are at with the parking funding of that project. I've not kept up to date with it.
So this is relating generally to operating costs.
To be clear on that, I thought, like, it will be OPEX, that it will be coming in as, it'll be surplus of OPEX, like there was a decision made not to sell the parking building, so it'll be operating revenue diverted every year for the next 30, 50 years, however long it takes to pay back the 46 million and the interest on the 46 million. So to me that looks like a very significant user pays, and in terms of what's happening in that city centre development, to me that'd be the biggest project, the biggest component of it, I would have thought.
You're correct in terms of there is $46 million allocated to come out of parking of debt to be funded through parking activity charges, so that should reflect that.
I guess I highlight it because I think it's really important we're clear and consistent, because if we are saying fair and equitable and consistent, I think it's important that we're very clear in a public setting around fair and equitable and consistent across council, because it is, we had the parking charges meeting, so part of the, I guess, gap in understanding around parking charges was the same issue, and same with out in, well, I use Papamoa as an example, but there are no doubt other pockets around the city where meetings take place where it's the same issue gets raised. And I think if we can be transparent around it, the community would see that there is actually a user pays component in the city centre, and that would help the people in the outer suburbs to understand that the people who are going to end up there are going to be paying more, and it will help the people paying the parking charges to understand why they're paying more.
We could just add the same is applicable to the airport, which also has a loan to the city centre.
Any other questions? Councillor Schuller?
One curiosity question potentially. Do you have any base data based on sort of number of community users across various assets that would then give you a baseline? So, for example, what it costs us to maintain our sports fields, how many people use them, so effectively, or what it costs to maintain in our swimming pools, aquatic facilities, for example, what it costs to maintain our indoor courts, and then sort of have, so if there was a baseline number to say, hey, this type of sport and rec activity, costs this much per person or human to use, and then, because we might start to get some tiers or some stratas of usage band cost. Sorry.
At a total activity level, like for example the library, we certainly have that in terms of what the total cost of the activity is and the amount that's funded through there, which is what's reflected in that policy. So yeah, yep.
Do we have the usage, like for libraries? How many people use? Oh, yeah.
We have that split by people who are TCC residents and residents outside of Tauranga in terms of library book issues, etc. So that sort of stuff. Not all the activities are library, but certainly book issues, yes. So if those particular activities are one that you decide to look at, then we can then drill down and give more information, but we don't want to do that across all activities because it'd be a lot of work for perhaps no benefit. So that's the next step, is identifying those activities where there's ones that you particularly want to explore or have got greatest opportunity. Then we'll come back with detail around each of those so that you can understand the costs and the opportunities.
And when we do that, it'd be good to talk with you about what information you want, because places like the libraries or building consents are data rich. So in the libraries you could have the number of membership cards or the number of book issues, which would be a very different number. Potentially the number of people who walk through the door. I don't know whether they've got a door count there. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it. Not everybody with a card uses it every day. Some people use that card once a week and take out 40 books, and some people use it once a month and take out one book. It's very different.
Want to say something, Councillor Morris, or you just... Any further questions? Any further to present? All right, well, thank you very much. I think that's a good start to get an overview as to user fees and charges and looking at where we're going with this. Obviously, this was a directive we've given, and I think it's a good time. We've had a number of feedbacks on a few of the different charges, and it'll be good to have a look into them a little bit more and put our flavour on where we're going with user fees and charges. So thank you very much, everybody.